About a year ago, I posted a video series to YouTube entitled Dowsing Research, where I looked into the parts and energy fields involved with dowsing, and I particularly focused toward the tail end of it on like water dowsing, where someone would use a willow stick or they would use dowsing rods. Because what was happening was there was a natural tracking field that would come off the willow stick, would come off the dowsing rods, travel horizontally until it struck a vertical field coming out of the ground. Now, after researching the tracking field, I found out it's not magic, it's not witchcraft, it's not even supernatural. It's as natural as the migration of animals, or a homing pigeon flying 100 miles back to their house, or you think of the stories of cats and dogs that have been separated from their owners and they've traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles back to their owners. This is a natural phenomenon, and that's what is being incorporated with the tracking fields that are coming off the rods or the Y stick. But what is very fascinating beyond that is the vertical fields coming out of the ground, and the more I researched those, the more I realized that was a horse of a different color and was going to have to take a completely different video series to delve into that type of energy, which I will classify as spirit field energy because it's different than anything else I've ever seen. But in order to address this, I'm going to have to take you all the way back decades ago to the beginning of this type of research. About 30 years ago, my wife was having allergic reactions to something in our house, and we learned about a type of applied kinesiology where some people are able to find what their bodies do not want by holding a pendulum over the object. And if their bodies want it, it will swing in one direction. If their bodies don't want it, it will swing in the other direction. Fortunately for us, this did work for us, and we found out she was allergic to tomatoes, and we were able to cut that out of her diet. This particular tablet here is a vitamin B, and I'm going to hold my hand as steady as I can over it. And if you look at the tip of my fingers, what's happening, there's a slight movement. Unintentional. Comes down through the arms and down through the fingers. Even if I was able to brace my hand completely, I could actually feel the unintentional movement in my fingers. That would cause that pendulum to move. The pendulum does not move on its own. It is moved by the unintentional, involuntary muscle movements. And we found this to be very accurate. As a matter of fact, I started using it to find out the strength of batteries. Because if a battery has a charge on it and I hold the pendulum over it, I will get a reading off of it. And if I need help, what I will do is I will touch the end of the battery so that will flood the negative ions so that it would actually want the positive, and it would shift the direction of it. I can let go of the end of it, and my body does not want the positive ions coming out of it. Now, of course, they've come up now with these new long life batteries, these long shelf life batteries, and they do not spray ions out the end of them, so I cannot use my pendulum to test it. But it's been interesting over the last 30 years to actually be able to test for battery strength using the pendulum. It's worked very accurately. If I get something that there's no reading off of it and I put it into an electric toothbrush, it doesn't run. If I do get a reading off of it, then it does run. Now let me show you real quick. This pendulum here is just a little kid's top, and I drilled a hole in the top here and a hole in the side here and strung a string through it, tied a knot in it. This is what I like. I like the shape of it. My wife likes a small bobber, and you'll notice that this is different than any pendulum you've ever seen on the internet, probably ever seen. Most people use crystals and long chains, and they ask their pendulum questions, and they set out graphs and try to get the pendulums to swing. You know, all sorts of different things. All we do is to see if our body is favorable or unfavorable to it. But what I found is that this is actually run off of an ion field, and I discovered this when I started to test frozen objects, because ions do not travel well through frozen objects. This field will go through plastic, it will read through glass, it will not read through metals, and it will not read objects that are frozen. So if I get like a bag of peas, frozen peas out of the refrigerator or the freezer, I hold this over it, I'll get absolutely nothing. But if I hold my finger on the peas so it thaws out a little bit through the bag, then I can get a reading as to whether my body does or doesn't want the peas, because that's how the ion field works. The field actually extends 6 inches from my hands, 3 inches from my toes and my spine, and about ½ inch over the rest of my body. And we also found, and I made myself a stick and taped samples of the major minerals on them: the calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, zinc, copper, iron, and manganese. And you will notice that I have little connections to them because these are paired elements. And I discovered that using this method, if I wanted to find out if there is calcium in a food, first I would test it, see what kind of a reading I got. You know, let's say I got a positive reading to it, and if I touched the sample of calcium, electrically my body would assume that calcium is in my body. And if there's calcium in the food, it will swing negative, because it's assuming that this calcium is already in me, I don't need any more. Inversely, if I put my finger on the calcium and it continues to swing positive, it's a good indication that there's magnesium in it, because calcium and magnesium try to balance each other. In order to double check the magnesium, I would put my finger on the magnesium, and if it suddenly goes negative, I know that there's magnesium in the food. So we were able to use this for 20 years, testing what is high and low in the foods that we were consuming. Similarly, the sodium, if I'm testing a food and I put my finger on the sodium, suddenly goes negative, we know that there's sodium in there. If it suddenly goes positive, we know that there's potassium in there. And we can double check by putting your finger on potassium. And if it goes negative, it's because it's high in potassium. So we were able to use this for 20 years to detect what is or is not in foods. And then about 10 years ago, a friend of mine came over to visit, and he brought me this small bottle of a product called Ormus, O-R-M-U-S. And after we were visiting, he had asked me to test it. He wouldn't tell me much about it, but just said, you know, run it through whatever tests you can, see what you can find. So after he left, I got out the stick with these samples on it, and first I tested the bottle, and I got no reading on it at all. And then I touched one by one the elements on the stick, the samples, and nothing changed. The pendulum just sat there dead. I thought, well, that's going nowhere quickly. I don't know what else to do. So I just set it aside on the dining room table. And about 4 or 5 hours later, I came back out and thought, well, let's try this again. So I got out the stick and started touching the samples and going down the list, and nothing. Got down to zinc, and it was reading that it was high in zinc. And then iron. It was also high in iron. Thought, where in the world, after the 4 or 5 hours, did it pick up the zinc and iron? And then I remembered that about an hour earlier, my wife and I were in the kitchen dining room area, and I had mentioned to her that my body is always low in zinc and iron. Well, now this thing is reading that it is high in zinc and iron. Now I don't understand what is happening to it. I don't even understand how the pendulum, what causes the muscles to twitch. You know, I don't understand that stuff. But all I know is that I spoke those elements, and now it's reading that it is high in those elements. Well, I thought, well, let's try an experiment here. I said, clear, and I spoke the word calcium. And then I touched it. It was reading high in calcium. Clear, magnesium. clear, no matter what element on here that I spoke, it would read that it was high in here. I thought, I don't understand this at all. And then to make matters even weirder, I started taking the Ormus, about half a teaspoon a day, and shortly afterwards discovered that I could speak an element, any element, and my body would read that it was electrically high in that element. And we're talking 118 elements off the periodic table. And then I discovered that I did not have to speak the element. I could just think the element, concentrate on the element, and my body would read that it was high in that element. And what that allowed me to do then is to take a product and set it down and start thinking through the elements on the periodic table. And when it got to an element that was high in that object, it would start to move the pendulum. And this was really an eye-opener. For example, we discovered that 2/3 of my wife's mascara contained lead and mercury and had to be thrown away. And a lot of her other makeups had nasty things in them and had to be disposed of. We discovered that after the E. coli outbreaks that affected the Chipotle restaurants, around that time that our organic fruits and vegetables started coming in sprayed with barium chloride and copper sulfate that had to be soaked in vinegar water and then soaked in soda water in order to get them out of it. We also found a lot of our foods contained cesium. A lot of cesium was coming in on our organic fruits and vegetables. Nasty stuff. We also discovered that the rice, the organic rice that my wife was eating that comes from Texas, had a lot of heavy metals and radioactive elements in it. And she was getting sick from those. And so the last time I was down in Texas, I picked up a sample of the topsoil, brought it home and tested it. It had the same heavy metals and radioactive elements in it. And I don't know what it is for that area. I've been getting samples. A missionary in Mexico has been sending me samples of the tortillas from the local market. And every once in a while, the tortillas will come in radioactive. And apparently, there is some mining of radioactive elements in that area. And it's my estimation, my guess, my best guess, is that there are some farmers who are irrigating their crops with water that is down in that radioactive level, and so they're irrigating their crops with radioactive water, and so when they harvest their corn and bring it in, the tortillas are coming back radioactive because of that. One day I was putting together the pre-mixed meals that I take with me when I go trucking. When I'm out here on the road, I like to blend up spinach and carrots and celery and onions and all sorts of things and toss in meat and blend it all together into a nice healthy drink and bring it with me on the road. And I was opening up a can of name brand mackerel, and my wife said, "Well, you can't eat that." She said, "That's full of industrial waste and chemicals." And I said, "Well, you're full of baloney." And she started arguing with me, and I got mad, and I said, "I'll prove it to you." So I opened up the top of the can and got my pendulum out and started going over it, over the list of elements, particularly aiming at the industrial waste elements and radioactive elements, and almost every one of them was in that mackerel. Apparently the Chinese, they fish farm in the rivers that are downstream from the industry, and the industry there has no qualms about dumping their sewage and dumping their waste, their industrial waste, into the water, which flows downstream into the fish farms, which they harvest and can and sell to us under brand name. It's like, I couldn't believe it. But where does this information come from? Where does the information about the 118 elements on the periodic table come from? I really do not know. And it's got even weirder yet, because there was a person who was having some health problems, a young guy, and I asked the parents to give me a hair sample just one hair, so I could try to see if there was something he was high or low in, something he was being exposed to that might give a key as to why his health was so poor. So they gave me a hair and had it in an envelope, and I started going down the 118 elements on the periodic table and didn't see anything that was really stood out until I got down to radon. And if you know anything about radon is a radioactive gas. Now, what was curious about this was the envelope itself did not show signs of radon. The hair did. And my wife was on the phone with the mother of this child, and I just mentioned to my wife to ask the mother if their house had ever been checked for radon, because I was getting a high radon reading off the hair. And that was about the most stupid thing I could have ever said. I wasn't thinking about how a mother would freak out, but she freaked. And she demanded that they leave their house, and they set up to leave for the weekend to go to a cabin somewhere. And I felt so bad, because I got on the phone and I talked to the husband, who was not freaking out. He was level-headed. And I told him, I said, no, it's not radon in the house, because it would be in the envelope. It must be some product that the child is putting in his hair. So they sent me a sample of several things that the child was using in his hair. And one thing read high in radon. And so I was reading up on radon, and radon is a radioactive gas that gives off, with the decay of the radioactive elements of uranium, actinium, thorium, and radium. So then I went down the list of those elements, and I found out that the hair and the shampoo sample that they sent me was high in thorium. And I looked on the internet, and thorium is a radioactive element that is fairly difficult to work with, but it's used in medical purposes. Well, it just happens that this company that makes the shampoo is a medical company. And so I went to the store, and I checked every product with their name on it on the shelf, their section of the shelves, and every product was high in thorium. So either the containers that they put their stuff in are irradiated with thorium, or their product is irradiated with thorium out the door. And so what I was picking up as radon was actually the thorium, but the half-life of thorium is like 1 billion years. And so I was literally picking up the radon that was going to be coming out of the thorium over the next 1 billion years. So not only do I not know where the information is coming from, but it appears that the source of it is outside of time. And I found that because reading radon gives me now 4 elements, the uranium, if I find your radon, I know I can start looking for uranium, actinium, thorium, or radium. I actually now, when I'm searching for radioactive elements, I'll look for the radon, because if I get a radon hit, then I know that I've got one of those other elements. I did find some butter the other day that was high in actinium. It's like, glad I found that. And I'm to the point now that I've found there's quite a few farmers' fields that are contaminated with high levels of certain things, whether it be molybdenum or cadmium or barium or actinium or cobalt. So now I've gotten to where I really don't care. If I'm going in to buy butter or cheese or something like that, I take the pendulum with me. And sometimes I have to dig around a while before I can find some butter that does not have nasties in it. I share these things with you to let you know that the pendulum use, although it looks stupid and it looks really hokey, but it has proven itself to be accurate, whether I'm testing DC power coming out of a battery, or I'm testing the currents in the wiring of my cars or trucks, or whether I'm going for things that people are allergic to, or whether I'm after finding minerals that are in things. It's accurate. It works. although it looks hokey, especially like if I'm tracking fields that are in the air, and I got the pendulum up there, and it's swinging, because I can either, here's a dilemma that I face, I could try to keep my fingers from moving and make it look like the pendulum is swinging on its own, but that's deceptive because it's the muscles, the involuntary movement that comes through the muscles and out the fingers that makes the pendulum move. So what I do is I just let the muscles move, and if I'm tracking fields that are in the air, sometimes it'll get strong and you can really see my hand moving, and a lot of people will say, well, of course the pendulum's moving, your hand's doing it, you're doing it. Well, of course I'm doing it involuntarily, but that looks really ridiculous. It looks really hokey. It looks really far-fetched, but it works. And it was because of the use of the pendulum that I was able to make a whole series of discoveries that will build upon each other and eventually bring us to the spirit field research that this entire video is about. So let's continue. One day my friend who brought me the Ormus asked me what I knew about orgonite, and I told him I didn't know my rocks that well. And he said, well, it's not a rock, it's actually a device that people are putting together and making all sorts of claims about what it will not do. And he asked me to look into it, which I did. And it's based upon the research of Wilhelm Reich and his work with an energy field called orgone. But people are of the belief that if they get resin molds and put in coils and metals and crystals, bits and bobs, as the British would say, and cast these things together, that they could somehow capture that orgone energy and try to get positive effects from it. But when I looked into these devices, what I found was a myriad of energies that were flowing through them. And I don't doubt that orgone is flowing through them too, but I also realized that EMF was getting caught up in them, especially in certain coils and crystals, and even the shape of the resin cones and pyramids. EMF was flowing out the tops and bottoms, splitting the ions out and spraying ions in different directions. And one gentleman was claiming that orgone has the ability to track people, and I was looking into that claim, and lo and behold, there was actually a tracking field coming off the tops of the cones and pyramids. And I went in to research it, and it wasn't because of the coils or the crystals or even the resin itself. It had to do with the carbon content of the resin and the other things that were inside of it.